planet Araxes was a stark landscape of jagged rocks and swirling dust storms. Amidst this desolation, Lyra, a young Thalkir alien, lay weakened, her slender frame shivering under the alien sun. Her tribe had left her here, alone, a punishment for defying the elders. As the sun dipped below the horizon, her hope waned with the light. Meanwhile, Captain Daniel Ross maneuvered his spacecraft, the Intrepid, through the asteroid belt encircling Araxes. He was a veteran explorer, having faced the unknown reaches of space more times than he could count. His mission was simple: chart the unexplored territories for potential resources. Yet as he approached the surface, a malfunction forced the Intrepid into an emergency landing sequence. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Captain Ross of the spacecraft Intrepid, executing emergency landing on Araxes. Brace for impact." Dan's voice was calm, collected, even as his ship rattled violently around him. The Intrepid thudded onto the surface with a jarring impact. Shaken but unharmed, Dan grabbed his survival kit and ventured outside, only to find himself in a sprawling wasteland. "Great, just my luck," he muttered, scanning the horizon. As night fell, he noticed a faint movement in the shadows. Cautiously, he approached, finding Lyra barely conscious. "Hey there, I'm not going to hurt you," Dan announced gently, kneeling beside her. Lyra looked up, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Who are you?" she whispered in her native tongue, which, to Dan's surprise, he understood, a fortunate result of his universal translator implant. "Name's Dan. I'm human, from Earth." "And you are?" "Lyra," she replied, her voice a mix of wariness and curiosity. "All right, Lyra, let's get you someplace safe. Can you walk?" With Dan's help, Lyra struggled to her feet. They trudged through the rocky terrain, making their way back to the Intrepid. Inside the ship, Dan rummaged through his supplies, finding a thermal blanket and water. "Here, this should help," he said, draping the blanket over Lyra's shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the water and drinking eagerly. "Why help me? Thalkir are not friends to humans." Dan chuckled softly. "Well, where I'm from, we help those in need. It's just what we do." As Lyra warmed up and regained her strength, she shared her story of exile. Dan listened intently, his expression growing solemn. "You've been through a lot, but you're safe now. We'll figure this out together." Lyra, still unsure but grateful, nodded. "Why are you here, Dan, from Earth?" "I was scouting for new worlds, resources, things to help back home. Didn't expect to find anyone, especially not someone like you." They talked for hours, sharing stories of their worlds. Despite their differences, a mutual respect began to form. Dan realized he couldn't leave Lyra here. He had to help her, not just for her safety, but because it was the right thing to do. "Tomorrow, I'll check the ship, see if we can send a distress signal. But for tonight, we should rest," Dan suggested. Lyra agreed, settling into a corner of the cabin. As they both drifted off to sleep, a plan began to form in Dan's mind. He would not only repair his ship, but also help Lyra reclaim her freedom. This strange and unforeseen partnership was just beginning, and together they faced the unknown future of Araxes. As the pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, Dan awoke to the soft hum of his damaged spacecraft. He stretched, his muscles stiff from the previous day's crash landing, and turned to check on Lyra. She was already up, gazing out at the barren landscape with a distant look in her eyes. "Morning," Dan greeted her, trying to inject a bit of warmth into the cold morning air. "Sleep well?" Lyra turned, her face unreadable. "As well as one can in a strange ship," she replied, her voice still laced with a hint of caution. "Fair enough. Let's see if we can't fix that today. I'm going to check on the ship's systems, see what we can salvage." Dan moved toward the control panel, his fingers dancing over the screens, checking readouts and diagnostics. Lyra watched him work, her curiosity piqued. "Can I help?" she asked, moving closer to the console. "Sure," Dan said, stepping aside to give her room. "Have a look here." He pointed to the navigation system, which flickered sporadically. "We need to stabilize this if we're going to get a signal out." Together, they tinkered with the console, Dan explaining the function of each component as they went. Despite her initial unfamiliarity, Lyra was a quick learner, and her deft fingers were soon making adjustments with minimal guidance. "Looks like you've got a knack for this," Dan remarked, impressed by her adaptability. Lyra smiled slightly. "Thalkir are taught to be quick learners. It's necessary for survival." As they worked, Dan found himself increasingly amazed not just by Lyra's technical skills, but by her resilience. You know, you're quite different from the stories we've heard about the Thalkir, he confessed. Lyra stiffened. And what stories are those? Dan hesitated, realizing he might have stepped into sensitive territory. Well, mostly about your advanced technology and strict social order. Many stories are based on truths, Lyra said quietly, turning back to the navigation system. But not all stories tell the whole truth. The morning passed into afternoon, and their efforts finally bore fruit. The navigation system stabilized and began emitting a weak distress signal. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Now that we've got that sorted, we should scout the area. Could be useful resources around, Dan suggested, ready to focus on their survival. Lyra agreed, and they prepared for a short expedition outside. As they equipped themselves with essentials from the ship, Dan handed Lyra a compact laser tool. What's this for? Lyra asked, examining the device. Protection, mostly. Never know what we might run into out there, Dan explained. They ventured out, Dan leading the way with a scanner. The landscape was even more unforgiving up close, with sharp rocks and steep ravines. But as they walked, Lyra pointed out various plants that looked desolate but were actually rich in nutrients. Thalkir training, Dan guessed, watching her expertly gather samples. Something like that, Lyra confirmed, a hint of pride in her voice. Their search uncovered a small cave system with water deposits, a crucial find. As they mapped the area, their conversation flowed more freely, ranging from tales of Earth to the rigid customs of the Thalkir. Despite the stark differences in their backgrounds, a mutual respect formed, grounded in their shared struggle to survive. As they returned to the Intrepid with their findings, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the rocky ground. They were no longer just two strangers from different worlds. They were teammates, each bringing their own strengths to the fore in the face of adversity. Thanks for today, Dan said as they stored their supplies. I couldn't have done it without you. Lyra nodded, allowing herself a small smile. Nor I without you. In the failing light, they sat down by the ship, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, each lost in thought about the uncertain days ahead, yet comforted by the unexpected alliance that was forming between them. The next few days on Araxes were marked by a routine that both Dan and Lyra gradually settled into. Each morning began with a status check of the ship's systems, now a shared task that Lyra seemed to relish, as it gave her a sense of control in an otherwise unpredictable situation. Dan noticed her increasing fascination with human technology, her questions growing more insightful and technical. Your tech is different from ours, Lyra observed one morning as they recalibrated the communication array. Less advanced in some ways, but more versatile. Dan grinned, handing her a tool. Versatility might be the only edge we humans have. We're pretty good at making do with what we've got. Lyra nodded thoughtfully. Thalkir technology is built to last, to be perfect, but it's not adaptable. If something unexpected happens, we often struggle. It sounds like your people value order and predictability, Dan said, tightening a bolt. We do, Lyra confirmed. Everything is planned, from your role in society to how you spend your days. Deviations are not well received. Dan sensed a touch of bitterness in her voice. And that's why you were exiled? Lyra paused, her tool hovering over the circuit board. I questioned our leaders, proposed new ideas for exploring beyond our assigned sectors. I thought they would appreciate initiative. And instead, they sent you here, Dan concluded softly. Lyra resumed her work, her movements a bit more forceful. Yes, to make an example out of me. Their conversation shifted the dynamic between them, weaving threads of empathy into their growing friendship. After their morning tasks, they would explore the surroundings, collecting samples and mapping the terrain. During one such exploration, they stumbled upon a patch of bioluminescent plants that illuminated a small cavern with a gentle blue glow. The sight was mesmerizing. Beautiful, isn't it? Dan remarked, watching Lyra's face light up with wonder. It's incredible, she replied, kneeling to examine the plants. These could be used to generate sustainable light sources. See, always the scientist, Dan chuckled, setting up a small device to capture energy readings. Lyra looked up at him, her expression serious. Being a scientist is all I know. It's my identity. Dan sat beside her, their shoulders touching lightly. Maybe this is your chance to redefine what that means, Lyra. Out here, you're not just a scientist. You're a survivor, a fighter, a friend. The word friend hung between them, new and fragile. Lyra considered it, then smiled slightly. And you, Dan? What are you out here? Me? He laughed. Just a pilot, I guess. A pilot a long way from home. But more than that, Lyra pressed. You are also a teacher, a protector. Dan looked at her, struck by her insight. Maybe you're right. Maybe we're both more than we thought we could be. As they made their way back to the Intrepid, their conversation turned to plans for improving their makeshift camp. Ideas flowed freely, from enhancing their shelter to refining the energy systems with the bioluminescent plants. That evening, as they sat by the ship, a makeshift meal warming beside them, the air between them was filled with an easy camaraderie. The stars overhead shone brightly, a tapestry of infinite possibilities. We make a good team, don't we? Dan said, his voice low in the quiet. Lyra nodded, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Yes, we do, and perhaps together we can find a way off this planet. The night deepened around them, filled with the sounds of a foreign world. But within the small bubble of light cast by the Intrepid, Dan and Lyra shared a moment of peace, their thoughts aligning with shared goals and the promise of tomorrow. Their journey was far from over, but they faced it together, each finding in the other a strength they had not known before. The tranquility of their newfound routine was shattered one crisp morning when the ground beneath Dan and Lyra's feet trembled slightly, an ominous prelude to chaos. Both instinctively turned their gazes skyward, where the peaceful blue was streaked with the fiery descent of alien crafts. The Garaxians, a warlike species known for their ruthless invasions, had found Araxes. Dan's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at his belt. Looks like we've got company, he muttered, his voice edged with determination. Lyra, who had only heard of the Garaxians through interstellar warnings, felt a surge of fear. Garaxians here? Why? No idea, but we can't stick around to find out, Dan replied quickly. He grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her toward the cover of nearby rocks. Stay low and follow my lead. As they ducked behind the jagged outcrops, the first of the Garaxian ships touched down, disgorging squads of armored soldiers. Their movements were swift, precise, as they began to secure the area. Peering from their hiding spot, Dan handed Lyra a pair of binoculars. Take a look. Anything seem familiar about their formation? Lyra observed intently, her mind racing. They're systematic, almost robotic. But there's nothing I recognize, no signs they're searching for something specific. That might be our only advantage, Dan whispered, formulating a plan. We need to keep them guessing, keep them off our trail. For the next few hours, Dan and Lyra moved stealthily, using the planet's rugged terrain to their advantage. Dan's military training proved invaluable as he instructed Lyra on guerrilla tactics, how to move silently, how to observe without being seen, and how to make use of the environment around them. As night fell, the Garaxians set up a temporary base, their ships casting eerie lights over the landscape. Dan observed their camp through night vision goggles, noting the patrols and their frequency. We need to disrupt their operations, slow them down while we figure out a long-term plan, he said, his mind racing through various scenarios. Lyra nodded, her initial fear replaced by a fierce resolve. What do you propose? A distraction, Dan said, pulling out a small device from his backpack. I have an EMP grenade. It won't permanently damage anything, but it should knock out their communications for a while. And during the blackout, we grab any intel we can and get a better understanding of their mission, Dan planned. Are you up for this? I am, Lyra confirmed, her voice steady. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the perimeter of the Garaxian camp. Dan counted the seconds, synchronizing their watches. On my mark, he instructed. At the designated moment, Dan threw the EMP grenade into the center of the camp. The explosion was silent, but the effect was immediate. Lights flickered and died, and the Garaxians scrambled in confusion. Using the chaos to their advantage, Dan and Lyra slipped into the camp. They avoided the bewildered soldiers, making their way to the central tent where they suspected the command unit was located. Inside, they found a holographic map displaying various strategic points on Araxes. Lyra quickly downloaded the data onto a portable drive. Got it, she whispered, her hands steady despite the adrenaline rush. Just as they were about to retreat, a Garaxian soldier stumbled into the tent. The alien's eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, Dan neutralized him with a swift, non-lethal blow. Heart's racing, isn't it? Dan joked quietly, seeing Lyra's wide eyes. Exhilarating, she admitted, a half-smile flickering on her face. They made their way back to their hiding spot just as the Garaxians managed to restore their systems. Safe for the moment, Dan and Lyra examined the stolen data. It revealed potential targets the Garaxians considered valuable, but nothing indicated their interest in Lyra, yet. As they prepared to move to a new hideout, Lyra felt a new kind of courage building within her. "We did it once. We can do it again." Dan looked at her, impressed and inspired by her growth. "Yes, we can, and we'll keep doing it until we're safe, or until we can get off this rock." Together, they set off under the cover of darkness, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with a newfound teamwork that was their strongest weapon. Dan and Lyra moved stealthily through Araxes' rugged terrain, now familiar territory under their careful surveillance. They had become adept at avoiding Garaxian patrols, using the information from their last raid to anticipate enemy movements. "This area here," Dan pointed to a section on the digital map they had recovered, "seems to be their main supply route. If we can disrupt it, we might slow down their entire operation." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the topography. "There's a narrow pass here, ideal for an ambush." Dan agreed, impressed by her strategic thinking. "Exactly. We hit them fast and vanish before they know what hit them." Over the next few days, they prepared their trap. Lyra, ever the quick learner, helped Dan set up a series of makeshift explosives, nothing lethal, but enough to cause confusion and delay. They camouflaged their devices with the natural debris of the planet, blending everything seamlessly into the environment. As the Garaxian convoy approached the pass, Dan and Lyra watched from a high vantage point. Dan held a remote detonator, his finger hovering over the button. Lyra, binoculars in hand, gave the signal. "Now," she whispered. Dan pressed the detonator. Explosions rocked the narrow pass below, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. The Garaxian vehicles halted, their formations thrown into chaos as soldiers scrambled to respond. "Come on," Dan said, already moving to the next phase of their plan. They darted down the hillside, moving to intercept the convoy from another angle. Using the confusion to their advantage, they darted among the disabled vehicles, placing additional disruptive devices to further hinder the Garaxians. Lyra's earlier uncertainty had vanished, replaced by a focused calm that matched Dan's. Together, they moved like shadows, unseen yet undeniably effective. Once their mission was completed, they retreated to a secondary hideout they had prepared earlier, a cave system that Dan had discovered and fortified. Inside, they monitored the aftermath of their attack through a series of remote sensors. "Their response time is getting slower," Lyra noted, analyzing the data. "Our tactics are working." Dan smiled wryly. "They're not used to this kind of resistance. Most civilizations just roll over when the Garaxians show up, but not us, huh?" "Not us," Lyra echoed, a fierce pride in her voice. Over the following weeks, they continued their guerrilla warfare, striking swiftly and vanishing without a trace. Each successful operation brought them more confidence, and with confidence, an even greater determination to survive. But their success did not go unnoticed. One evening, as they were planning their next move, Dan's makeshift scanner beeped ominously, a signal that a large-scale search was being organized. "They're upping their game," Dan observed, examining the output. "Looks like they're bringing in more troops, and heavier equipment." "We need to change our strategy," Lyra suggested. "Maybe it's time to think about an escape plan." Dan nodded, his mind racing through possible options. "We need more intel. If we can find out where they're concentrating their forces, we might find a weakness." Lyra agreed. "Let's do one more raid. If we can get into their command ship, we could access their full deployment plans." "High risk," Dan cautioned, looking at Lyra with concern. "High reward," she countered, her eyes steely. "We can't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, we either get caught or run out of resources." Dan knew she was right. "Okay, we'll do it. One last raid." As they prepared for what might be their most dangerous mission yet, the bond between them had never been stronger. They were no longer just survivors, but warriors, partners in a fight neither had anticipated, but both were determined to win. Their shared resolve would soon be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The night was eerily silent as Dan and Lyra approached the Garaxian command ship. Concealed by the darkness and the uneven terrain, they moved with precision, every step carefully calculated. Dan led the way, his experience in covert operations evident, while Lyra followed, her senses sharply tuned to any signs of danger. Reaching the outer perimeter of the ship without detection, Dan paused, scanning the area with a handheld device. "No patrols in immediate vicinity," he whispered. "Looks like our timing is right." Lyra nodded, her focus intense. What's the entry point? Dan pointed towards a less fortified hatch they had identified from their earlier surveillance. There. It's less guarded, but will require a quick bypass of the security lock. Together, they crept to the hatch. Dan worked quickly, his tools deftly disabling the lock, while Lyra kept watch. With a soft hiss, the hatch opened, inviting them into the belly of the enemy vessel. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit and empty. The Garaxians were likely focused on external threats, not expecting an intrusion from within. They made their way to the central data hub, a room filled with servers and communication equipment. Dan set up a portable interface device. This should give us access to their operational files. We need to be quick. Lyra stood guard at the door while Dan's fingers flew over the interface. Screens flickered, data streamed, and then suddenly, everything they needed was displayed before them. Got it, Dan exclaimed softly. Looks like they're planning a major offensive, not just here, but across several. He was interrupted by a sudden alert from the system. The screen flashed a security warning, and within moments they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Time to go, Lyra hissed, pulling Dan away from the console. They fled through the corridors, retracing their steps towards the hatch. The sound of Garaxian soldiers echoed behind them, a cacophony of orders shouted in their harsh, guttural language. Just as they were about to reach the hatch, a squad rounded the corner ahead of them. Dan and Lyra skidded to a halt, trapped. With no time to think, Dan pulled Lyra into a side corridor and found a narrow maintenance shaft. They squeezed inside just as blasts echoed where they had been moments before. Hidden within the confines of the shaft, they caught their breath. Dan looked at Lyra, his eyes serious. That was too close. Lyra, her face pale but determined, nodded. We got what we came for, though. As they made their way out of the shaft and back to the surface of Araxes, Dan reviewed the data they had managed to download onto his portable device. What he found made his blood run cold. Among the detailed invasion plans and strategic targets, there was a file on Lyra. It was marked with a priority tag from the Thalkir leadership. They sent the Garaxians after you, Dan said, his voice low, handing the device to Lyra. Your people, they ordered this. Lyra scanned the document, her expression turning from shock to a hardened resolve. I was a fool to hope they might forgive my insubordination. Dan put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're in this together, remember? Now more than ever, we need a plan not just to survive, but to fight back. Lyra met his gaze, her decision firm. Let's do more than just escape. Let's make sure they never hunt anyone else. With renewed purpose, they set about devising a plan to turn the tables on both the Garaxians and the Thalkir. What began as a fight for survival on a remote planet was escalating into a battle for justice and retribution. As they prepared for their most daring move yet, the bond between them solidified, forged in the fires of adversity and the shadows of betrayal. As dawn broke over the rugged landscape of Araxes, Dan and Lyra made their final preparations. Hidden in a narrow canyon, they outlined their strategy on a makeshift map spread across the rocky ground. Their plan was audacious, a direct assault on the Garaxian command ship to not only steal critical technology, but also send a decisive message to both the Garaxians and the Thalkir. We'll need to be quick and precise, Dan said, his eyes scanning the terrain leading up to the Garaxian base. Once we're inside, it's going to be about moving fast, avoiding engagement as much as possible. Lyra nodded, her features set in a mask of determination. I'll handle the navigation to the engine room. You focus on securing a path out. They were interrupted by the distant hum of a patrol unit. Ducking behind a large boulder, they watched as a squad of Garaxian soldiers passed by, oblivious to their presence. Once the danger had moved on, they resumed their planning. Once we reach the engine room, we'll install this, Lyra said, holding up a small device. It's a high-yield explosive, enough to cripple their ship and disable their warp capabilities. Dan looked at the device, then at Lyra. You realize this is a one-way trip? We might not make it out. Lyra met his gaze steadily. I know, but this ends here, one way or another. Their approach to the Garaxian ship was covered under the guise of a dust storm, a common occurrence on Araxes, but one they had learned to use to their advantage. Visibility was poor, and the roaring wind muffled the sound of their movements. They reached the outer hull undetected and used a plasma cutter to gain access through a maintenance hatch. Inside, the corridors were stark and dimly lit, the air filled with a low, ominous hum. Dan and Lyra moved with practiced stealth, navigating through the maze-like structure towards the heart of the ship. They encountered minimal resistance, as most of the crew was mobilized to handle the effects of the storm. Reaching the engine room, Lyra quickly set to work on installing the explosive device, her hands steady despite the magnitude of their actions. Dan stood watch, his weapon ready, his senses alert for any sign of discovery. The installation was completed in minutes, but as Lyra activated the timer, alarms began to blare throughout the ship. "We've been detected," she said, her voice calm despite the rising chaos around them. "Time to go," Dan replied, leading the way back towards the hatch they had entered through. Their escape was far from smooth. Garaxian soldiers, now alerted to their presence, converged on their location. Blaster fire filled the corridors, forcing Dan and Lyra to take a more circuitous route out. They moved quickly, covering each other's backs, their teamwork seamless. Just meters from the hatch, a blast caught Dan off guard, throwing him against the wall. Lyra rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "I'm okay," he grunted, although his arm hung limply at his side. They stumbled through the hatch and out onto the planet's surface, the storm still raging around them. Behind them, the command ship shuddered violently as the explosive device fulfilled its purpose. Flames burst from the engine room, spreading rapidly. As they made their way back to their hideout, the ground shaking beneath their feet, Lyra supported Dan, her face grim. "We did it," she said, looking back at the burning wreckage. "We did," Dan agreed, pain etching his features. "Let's just hope it's enough." Back at their shelter, they tended to Dan's injuries and prepared for any potential retaliation. But as hours turned into days without sign of pursuit, it became clear that their bold move had paid off. The Garaxian presence on Araxes was crippled, their command chain in disarray. Dan and Lyra watched the horizon, knowing that their fight might not be over, but understanding that they had struck a significant blow against those who sought to control them. They had not only survived, they had turned the tide, their courage and resolve altering the course of their fates forever. In the aftermath of their daring raid on the Garaxian command ship, Dan and Lyra found themselves in a brief period of calm. The destruction they had caused was significant, scattering the Garaxian forces and leaving them in disarray. With the immediate threat diminished, they had a chance to plan their next move. Sitting together outside their makeshift shelter, they gazed up at the star-filled sky. Dan, his arm in a makeshift sling, seemed contemplative. "We've changed the game, Lyra. Not just for us, but potentially for anyone else the Garaxians or the Thalkir might try to bully." Lyra nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I never imagined I'd be part of something like this. When I was exiled, I thought my life was over. But meeting you, it's given me a purpose I never thought I'd have." Dan smiled at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've got a fighter's spirit, Lyra. You were never meant for exile." Their conversation drifted to what lay ahead. With the Garaxians weakened, they had a window to escape the planet. The stolen data from the command ship included coordinates to several habitable worlds, none under Thalkir or Garaxian control. "Here," Dan pointed to a spot on the digital map. "This planet, Xionara. It's a free colony, not aligned with any major powers. We could start over there, maybe warn others, help prepare them." Lyra considered this, the idea of continuing their fight in a different form appealing to her. "That sounds like a place where we could make a difference. Not just live, but contribute, protect." They began repairs on the Intrepid with renewed vigor, salvaging Garaxian technology to enhance its systems. Working side by side, they found a rhythm, their partnership deepening into a seamless collaboration. Lyra, once a scientist constrained by the rigid expectations of her society, found new ways to apply her knowledge, while Dan discovered a sense of hope that he hadn't realized he'd lost. Several days later, as they prepared the Intrepid for takeoff, Dan looked over at Lyra, who was double-checking their navigation settings. "You ready for this?" he asked, a note of excitement in his voice. Lyra turned to him, her smile bright. "More than ready. Let's go make a new home." The engines of the Intrepid roared to life, a powerful sound that marked the end of their time on Araxes. As the ship lifted off, leaving the scarred planet behind, Dan and Lyra watched through the rear viewport. They were leaving much more than a planet. They were leaving their pasts behind too. During their journey to Xionara, they shared stories of their lives, their dreams, and what they hoped to find in their new beginning. Xionara represented more than a safe haven. It was a promise of a future where they could put their skills to use for a greater good. Landing on Zayanara was like coming out of a long, dark tunnel into light. The planet was vibrant with sprawling cities and lush landscapes. They were welcomed by a community that valued freedom and resilience, traits that Dan and Lyra had come to embody. As they settled into their new life, helping to strengthen the colony's defenses, they often looked back on their journey. The challenges they had faced on Araxes had forged them into more than survivors. They were guardians, ready to stand against any force that threatened their newfound peace. Sitting together one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Dan turned to Lyra. "Think we'll ever get a break from all this excitement?" Lyra laughed, her eyes sparkling. "I hope not. After all, adventure seems to suit us." Their laughter mingled with the twilight air, a sound of pure joy and contentment. As the stars began to appear, they knew that their adventure was just beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond unbreakable and their spirits undeterred.